Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very special presentation today. As we gathered here today, it's vital we also remember the peoples who have gathered here for millennia. This is the Treaty 7 land of the Indigenous peoples of Southern Alberta, the Blackfoot Nations of Siksika, Mcgandy, Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley, and the historic home of the Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. It is with the goal of reconciliation that we acknowledge the land on which we gather, and we thank the elders of these nations for their timeless contributions to this land. And as you know, Kirby Centre has had a long-standing tradition of honoring our veterans and fallen heroes with a very meaningful annual Remembrance Day service, attended in the past by some 200 to 250 guests each year. We were quite disappointed this year that we were not going to be able to have that service. We also wanted to make sure that you were aware that we had 2 years ago installed a memoriam display in the halls of Kirby Centre, honoring many of the fallen from the various conflicts over several generations. And I hope that you will have an opportunity to visit Kirby Centre, and it's rather fascinating to wander the halls on the 3rd floor to view each of these photos and learn a little bit of their lives and their stories. This year, being conscious of the health and safety of our staff and members and our service supporters, we are determined that it was not prudent to hold the service this year, and instead we'll remember those brave souls and honor our military by way of a virtual presentation this Remembrance Day week, beginning with today's exciting presentation. We are so pleased that you've joined us today as we welcome Lieutenant Colonel Peter Boyle, President of VALOUR Canada. We look forward to having him share this amazing piece of history about the soldiers of the Fighting 10th, who were from Calgary and bravely fought in the First World War. Peter's remarkable career spans 3 key areas which occurred concurrently throughout his life. He joined the Army Reserve with the Royal Regiment of Canada as an infantryman in Toronto, where he served for several years prior to being commissioned as a logistics officer. His civilian career would be in the information technology sector with Bell Canada, where he worked in various positions supporting and managing complex projects. He also had a keen interest in military history, which saw him leading battlefield tours in Northwest Europe, First and Second War, and Southern Ontario, War of 1812 and Fenian raids. In 2006, Peter was transferred by Bell Canada office to the office in Calgary and concurrently transferred to the Calgary Highlanders, a local Army Reserve regiment. In 2007, he volunteered to serve on Operation Athena in Afghanistan and deployed in early 2008. Lieutenant Colonel Boyle served in Kandahar, Afghanistan, as part of the National Support Element until September 2008. On return from Afghanistan, Peter continued to work in various management positions within the information technology sector, while continuing to serve as an officer with the Calgary Highlanders. This period saw him organize and lead 2 battlefield tours to Europe in 2010 and 2015, and be the project, and I am sorry, but I seem to have lost the end of, at the end of your welcome. I'm terribly sorry there, Peter. But at this given moment, I think that what I would like to do is turn it over to Peter, and quite a storied career that you have had, and exciting adventures that we're looking forward to hearing today. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your work with VALOUR Canada, and what exactly does VALOUR Canada do?
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Colleen. So I guess the last bit of that introduction, which you did a great job on, is that in 2016, I brought together my information technology background and my interest in military history and took over the role as president of VALOUR Canada. And VALOUR Canada is a not-for-profit organization based here in Calgary. And we do military history military history education programming for youth across the country. And we believe it's important for the youth of today to know what it is Canadians have fought and died for in the years past. And we do that through documentary videos, through some virtual tours, again, tying in my information technology background with my military history interest, as well as running programs in museums from coast to coast. So that's pretty much what Valor Canada does, and I encourage everyone to visit our website to learn more about us. And with that, I guess, am I good to kick off?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to see if this works here. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen? And it's okay. Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. And again, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Over the next little while, I would like to tell the story of some Calgarians who fought with the 10th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the First World War. I think as we approach the 11th of November, it's important for us to remember what these soldiers did. And for many of us, we'll have relatives that we'll think of on the 11th. However, if you don't, or if you, I guess I'd encourage you to maybe think of some of those that I'm going to talk about today. Sure, we can advance this. All right. So the 10th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was formed at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It was primarily made up of officers and soldiers from Calgary and Winnipeg. It was part of the 1st Canadian Division, and it fought on almost every Canadian battle of the First World War. So what I'd like to do is to tell the story of the First World War through the narratives of 6 key soldiers. And these soldiers are listed on your screen right now. So the first is Russell Lambert Boyle. Russell was born in Port Colborne, Ontario. He traveled west like so many people did in the early part of the 20th century. He had served in the Boer War and was a member of the local militia. At the time of the outbreak of the war, he was ranching near Crossfield, and we'll learn more about him as we go. Next is Chukotaro Iwamato. So he was born in Japan, and most people would not think of Japanese Canadian soldiers fighting on the front. But Iwamato was living in Vancouver at the outbreak of the war, and due to some discrimination, was not actually able to join up in a battalion on the West Coast. And he traveled to Calgary, where he was more accepting, and he joined up in Calgary and went overseas and fought during the First World War. Next is Arthur George Knight. Arthur was born just south of London in Maida Vale, and like so many, emigrated from England and settled in the West. The next will be David Mcgandy, and Mcandy was born on the east coast, northeast coast of Scotland, up near Inverness, and similarly emigrated to Canada and was homesteading at the beginning of the war. David had served in the Seaforth Highlanders in Scotland prior to the First World War and prior to emigrating to Canada, so did have a bit of military experience, which we'll see came in handy as we went. James Alexander Milne was yet another Scottish immigrant, and he was working for the Canadian Pacific Railway here in Calgary at the outbreak of the war. And finally, Dan Ormand had been born in Ontario as well and had traveled west and was a lawyer at the outbreak of the war and serving in the local militia. So we're going to talk about the First World War through the eyes of these 6 soldiers, and off we go. So on our left is Russell Lambert Boyle, again a rancher from Crossfield, an officer in the local militia with the 15th Light Horse, and Dan Ormand had been an officer in the cavalry as well. You'll see him on the right. And when war broke out at the beginning or the middle of August 1914, all the local militia units mobilized. And all of the soldiers from all these various militia units, so in Calgary, it would have been the Calgary Rifles, the 15th Light Horse, to name a few, traveled to Valcartier. And over 25,000 local militia soldiers arrived in Valcartier, Quebec. Now, Valcartier is just outside of Quebec City. And they formed the 1st Canadian Division. All of the local names of the regiments were moved aside, and they just numbered the battalions 1 through 16. So 16 battalions. And with all the supporting bits. So the battalions were named were from infantry units. And then there was engineers, there was artillery, there was signals and service corps, medical corps, and all the extra bits to form one self-contained Canadian division, which was to go off and fight during the First World War. This newly formed division sailed for France in October of 1914. Correction, sailed for England in October of 1914. And Lieutenant Colonel Russell Boyle was appointed as the commanding officer of the 10th Battalion. So he led one of the key battalions that went overseas. Dan Ormand, who we spoke about, was a captain, and he was holding the position of adjutant, which is so the senior captain in the battalion and senior administrator. And in the battle, we'll see the key role he played. The Canadians arrived in England and started training just west of London, or fairways west of London, on the Salisbury Plain. And the Salisbury Plain is known for where Stonehenge is. So you can see down at the bottom, the 10th Battalion out for a route march, walking past Stonehenge. And it was a horrible winter. They got horrible flooding. The soldiers lived in miserable conditions in tents, but they learned the business of war. Many British regulars who had come over, who'd learned from the fighting in 1914, had returned to England to train these new contingents that were going over to fight in France. Similarly, in Canada, mobilization continued of new battalions. So Arthur Knight, one of our characters, he joined up with the 46th Battalion, and he did his training in Saskatchewan. And James Alexander Milne, he joined the 50th Battalion, which was a Calgary battalion, in January of 1915, and he started training at Sarcee Camp. And here we can see a picture of Sarcee Camp, and for those who ever travel out towards Signal Hill on the west side of the city, you can see some of the numbers on the side of the hill, which were named after the battalions that had mobilized, trained at Sarcee Camp, and then went overseas. And there's always a bit of a romanticized view of the soldiers carrying these rocks up and placing them on the side of the hills. I suspect that on more than one occasion, there was a sergeant yelling at a private for doing something bad and said, "You pick up that rock and run up the side of the hill and place it there." And the soldiers got a little bit creative as they got into more and more trouble. But today we can still see those numbers for those battalions on the side of Signal Hill. And there are actually many more of those numbers all around that area, but many have been lost to time. But thankfully, we still have quite a few. By the spring of 1915, the war in Europe had slowed down for the winter. And David Mcandy, he joins the 46th Battalion on the 5th of April, 1915. So he and his brother had been homesteading, and his brother stayed behind. And because he had military service, he went off to war. I can only imagine that some of these fellows who had traveled, who come from England and Scotland, after 2 or 3 winters on the prairie, were thinking a free trip home to England and get out of a Canadian winter didn't sound like such a bad idea. James Milne, he arrived in England in April of 1915. And then we can see Lieutenant Colonel Boyle and Russell Boyle and Dan Ormand. They've moved now, the 1st Canadian Division, to Belgium. And they were beginning to learn the business of war. And that brings us to the night of the 22nd of April, 1915, and the Second Battle of Ypres. The Germans, in order to break a hole in the Allied lines, on the 22nd of April, released for the first time in large quantities chlorine gas on the Western Front. And this was a horrible event, and the French troops and the French colonial troops that were holding the line were immediately overcome by the gas and evacuated or retreated from the line. This created a huge hole in the Allied lines that the Germans were going to break through. And if they'd managed a large breakthrough, they could have pushed to the coast and cut off a large portion of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And at this time, I'm going to just play a bit of an audio, and I might get Colleen just to confirm that everybody can hear it, of Dan Ormand telling what happened just before the attack on Kitchener's Wood. So let's see if this works here.
Not hearing on our end yet.
Oh, you're not? Okay, I'm going to go back here. I think I have to make an adjustment on the, sorry everybody.
Again, it's another learning curve. We've done video, but not audio. So
okay, let's just see if this works now. And I just rewind this a little bit. If not, we'll just push on. Can we hear that?
No.
No. Okay, then I'm not gonna spend too much time on it. But it's interestingly, we have an audio recording of Dan Ormand talking about being called forward to the brigade headquarters, and the brigade commander at the time was Arthur Currie, who many of you will know commanded the Canadian Corps before the end of the war, or by the end of the war. And the 10th and the 16th battalions were given the task of breaking a hole into the flank of the Germans who are advancing. So you can imagine there are tens of thousands of Germans advancing, and 2 infantry battalions, which amount to just under 2,000 soldiers, are told to punch into the side of these Germans and stop their advance. And that is what occurs on at about 11 p.m. on the 22nd of April. The 10th and the 16th battalions, the 10th in the lead and the 16th, charge towards Kitchener's Wood. At the time, it wasn't known as Kitchener's Wood, and that is where some British guns had been abandoned, and the French Kitchens, and that's how the Kitchener's Wood came, were stationed. The counterattack into the flank of the Germans stopped their advance. They did not know in the middle of the night in this fighting how big the advance was going to be, or how big the advance was, and how many soldiers were coming, but it caused them to pause, which we'll find out later really was a huge benefit to the Allies. Of the 816 soldiers of the 10th that went into battle, 193 were still on their feet the next morning. 21 of the 25 officers were casualties, including Russell Boyle, who had been wounded, shot by 5 machine gun rounds.
Excuse me, Peter, for interrupting.
Yes.
One of our guests has just popped up here and suggested that you revert back to your PowerPoint share.
There we go. Sorry.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
And I would like to suggest that I usually follow up with all of our guests following the presentations. And so perhaps if you can give me that link, I can send that out and people can listen to it as they can on their own time.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, we can do that for sure. And apologies for the technical. I forgot to reshare this screen when I was trying to working.
You've got some great graphics there we don't want to miss.
Fair enough. So the attack on Kitchener's Wood was part of the Battle of St. Julien, which many Canadians would have heard, and that is part of the larger battle, Second Battle of Ypres, which Ypres is a town in Belgium, which was really fought over for the better part of 4 years. The counterattack by the 10th and the 16th was described by Marshal Foch, who was the commander, French commander, as one of the finest acts in the war. And it really stopped the German advance and saved the Channel ports. The overall Battle of St. Julien raged for a total of 12 days, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second here. So these are, Dan Ormand was the senior officer left unwounded, and he took command of the 10th Battalion with, again, less than 200 soldiers. And this is his field sketch and his map, or in his notepad, is from the battle. So you can see here, it was the 23rd of April in the morning, and he had over 50% casualties, only 5 officers at this stage unwounded, and where he'd sketched out the counterattack. And I would like to thank the Calgary Highlanders Regimental Museum and Archives for some of these objects. I was a curator there for a while, and we hold these. So the battle subsides, and Colonel Boyle, who's evacuated back, he succumbs of his wounds on the 25th of April, 1915, in a place called Popering, just west of Ypres, at a casualty clearing station. He is the first of the casualties of our group of 6. And here we can see a telegram sent to his wife, Laura, from the Prime Minister of Canada, Robert Borden, expressing his sympathy for the loss of Colonel Boyle.
Wow.
So the second battle of Ypres, there were over 5,000 Canadian casualties, numbers that are almost unimaginable today, but we'll see actually pale in comparison to some of the numbers later on in the war. And we all probably have heard of John McCrae and In Flanders Fields, and it was during this larger second battle of Ypres that he was inspired to write the poem In Flanders Fields, and we published later that year, and would be really the beginning of thinking of the poppy, which would be taken by the Legion after the war, as a way of remembrance and a remembrance of Flanders. So Dan Ormand's wounded. He is evacuated out, but returns to duty in May, which is excellent. And by then, reinforcements are coming from Canada. Lance Corporal now, David Mcgandy, he's been promoted because of his previous military service, and Private Arthur Knight, they arrive in England and are sent to the 10th Battalion during the summer of 1915. And we can see down below, James Milne, he's arrived in England and he's managed to go AWOL and finds himself in a little bit of trouble early on, and is confined to barracks for 28 days and is given some forced labor as well. Through the rest of 1915 into 1916, we now enter the Battle of Mount Sorel, which all of these individuals would have fought at. But by the late 1916, we're looking at the Battle of the Somme, which many will have heard of. So the Battle of the Somme was a large Allied attack that started on the 1st of July, 1916. And Arthur Knight, one of our soldiers, he's wounded at the fighting during the Somme. Prior to that attack, James Milne has arrived with the 10th Battalion, and Dan Ormand is promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and he actually takes command of the 10th Battalion following the fighting on the Somme. This is the first time, well, they actually don't fight together, but all 4 Canadian divisions. We started off with 1 Canadian division, but as the war progressed and as reinforcements were needed, we now have 4 Canadian divisions who all fought at different times during the Somme, but not together. Over the summer of 1916, Private Iwamato joins up in Calgary, and he starts to make his way through the training system and towards the front. The fighting on the Somme saw over 24,000 Canadian casualties in just 2 months of fighting. The Canadian Corps arrived on the front on the 15th of September, and by the time they withdrew in the middle of November, had 24,000 casualties, which pales in comparison to the British casualties from the 1st of July onwards. But still is an incredible number. And some will have heard of the Newfoundland Regiment. They fought on the first day of the Somme at Beaumont-Hamel and took extreme casualties on that day too. This fellow on our right, you can see he took a piece of shrapnel through his helmet and got a head wound, but is luckily carrying on with the battle and not injured too harshly. During the fighting on the Somme, now Sergeant David Mcandy, he's been promoted, lots of casualties, and he's obviously showing some leadership abilities, is awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. And this is the 2nd highest award for gallantry in the Commonwealth. So many will have heard of the Victoria Cross. The Distinguished Conduct Medal is 1 level below that. And he's awarded that for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He's displayed great courage and coolness on several occasions under heavy fire and has throughout set a fine example to others. So the Battle of the Somme comes to a conclusion, and the Canadian Corps actually moves north and into the Vimy area over the winter of 1916-17, and they take many of the lessons learned on the Somme, learned through horrible lessons, and start to put them together in what we really think of as modern warfare. So the coordination of artillery with the infantry, the coordination of tanks, which wasn't used so much in Vimy, but just this combined arms is what we call it nowadays. Use of all the tools to advance. We think of telling our private soldiers what the plan is, so when the officers and the sergeants are put out of commission, the privates can continue with the mission. We do rehearsals. All of this happens during the winter of 1916, 1917, and brings us to the 9th of April, 1917, which everybody will know was the attack on Vimy Ridge. By now, Private Iwamato has joined the battalion, and this would see the 5 remaining soldiers together in battle. And remarkably, none of them would be injured or killed during the fighting at Vimy, even though the 10th suffered 101 killed, 252 wounded, and 21 missing, for a total of almost 50% casualties from the entire battalion. But thankfully, our 5 are still okay. Overall, the Canadians would suffer more than 10,000 casualties in the 4 days of fighting. And we can see on the right-hand side, Colonel Ormand mounted on a horse and leading the 10th Battalion just before Vimy. Just a few weeks later, fighting east of Vimy, so the Canadians have continued to push east, there was a large attack at Arlo Loop, and 120 of the 10th Battalion would be killed in this attack. And because they were forced to withdraw afterwards, so many of those killed were not recovered, and over 101 were missing, including James Alexander James Alexander Milne, who was killed during this attack, and his body was not recovered from the battlefield. So he's missing, which we'll talk about later. So unfortunately, that's the second one of our 6 soldiers who's been killed during the fighting. The summer of 1917 sees the Battle of Hill 70. So this is a large attack north of Vimy at a place called Lens. And Private Iwamato would be awarded a military medal for gallantry. And that's Private Iwamato on the right-hand side, upper right. And the military medal is a gallantry medal. Similarly, David Mcgandy would be awarded his second gallantry medal, a military medal as well. Dan Ormand, who was the commander of the battalion, would be awarded the Distinguished Service Order. And one of the 10th Battalion, I really wasn't talking about today, Private Brown, Harry Brown, he would be awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry at the Battle of Hill 70. There were so many gallantry awards to the 10th Battalions, they started become known as the Gallant Canadians, and really was one of the most outstanding battalions of the Canadian Corps during the war. In 2 weeks of fighting, the Canadians would suffer over 9,200 casualties. But again, thankfully, our soldiers, the remaining soldiers, were not affected. By the fall of 1917, we're at the Battle of Passchendale. So Passchendale occurs back up near where we were at St. Julien in Belgium. And the horrible rains of the fall of 1917 really turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud. And many will have heard of the Battle of Passchendale. By now, David Mcandy has been promoted to a company sergeant major, and following the battle would actually be commissioned to made a lieutenant. Dan Ormand is promoted out and now is commanding a brigade, and he's got the nickname Dangerous Dan, and that's General Ormand following the Battle of Passchendale. In 1 month of fighting, again, the Canadians would suffer over 12,000 casualties at Passchendale, but would take Passchendale Ridge. We think of ridges out here in Alberta when we look west of the city, but Passchendale Ridge was really only a few meters above ground, above the average height in the area, but did give the ability for the Germans to observe and put down fire. So taking Passchendale Ridge took the pressure off the town of Ypres in Belgium. So a very, very important battle for all of the Allied forces, but the Canadians in particular. The spring of 1918, the fall of 1917, the Russians are put out of the war during the Russian Revolution, and the Germans realize with the Americans coming into the war in 1917, late 1917, that they have an opportunity, they need to take the initiative, and they launch a large attack in the spring of 1918, which the Canadians actually did not have a lot of involvement with. And they pushed the Allies back all the way to the town, almost to the town of Amiens, where they're finally stopped in the spring of 1918. The Canadians are kept out of that fighting, and with the arrival of the Americans and the reorganization of the units, the Allies get ready for a big advance, big push in the summer of 1918. And this is what brings us to the last 100 days. So the last 100 days kicks off on the 8th of August, 1918. And those 100 days takes us to the armistice on the 11th of November. And the Allies break through 13-kilometer advance on the first day on the 8th of August. And it's known as the Black Day of the German Army. The Germans are really now on the retreat, and the Allies are pushing forward. Our one fellow, David Mcgandy, he's promoted to captain, and he's awarded the Military Cross for his gallantry on the 8th of August, 1918. However, some of the heaviest fighting of the war is now going to happen in the last 100 days as we push towards the defeat of the Germans. And we're going to see some additional casualties. So less than a week later, Captain Mcgandy, on the 15th of August, 1918, is way back from the front. So here's an officer who's been awarded a Military Cross, a Distinguished Conduct Medal, a military medal. He's been mentioned in dispatches. He's been at the front of attacks on almost every front. And yet he's killed far, far from the front in reserve, what we would call harassing artillery fire, where the Germans are firing artillery into the back just to try and do some damage. And he's wounded and dies a few minutes later. So we lose a third of our soldiers, Captain David Mcgandy, on the 15th of August. The Canadians and the Allies continue to push east, and in early September, break through the DQ line, as it was known, Chukotaro line. I apologize for my horrible French. And we see Sergeant Arthur Knight being at the front of this. And I'm not going to read his citation, but Arthur is awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry in seizing the town of Villers-le-Cagnicourt on the 2nd of September, 1918. And I'll just leave that up for a second so that you can see the outstanding work that he did, pushing forward, supporting his platoon, taking enemy casualties, and ensuring that the advance continued.
Wow.
But unfortunately, on the same day of that attack, Private Iwamato would be killed in action. Again, advancing near Villers-le-Cagnicourt, struck in the heart by an enemy machine gun bullet and instantly died. He's buried at a place called Upton Wood Cemeteries, just west of Villers-le-Cagnicourt. And horribly, the very next day, Arthur Knight, again at the front of things, is wounded by an enemy shell and is evacuated back, but dies shortly afterwards. So the 2nd and 3rd of September are horrible days for our soldiers.
Oh, that's terrible.
So the advance continues, and for the next 70 days, the Canadians would push east, and by the 11th of November, have seized or are at the town of Mons, and on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, we have the armistice, which is what we commemorate this coming Wednesday at 11 o'clock. During the course of the First World War, as a bit of a summary, 619,000 men and women enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, over 424,000 overseas. 60,000 would be killed, 172,000 were wounded, and all of that from a population of just 8 million. So the Canadians did incredible work. Through the winter of 1918-1919, the Allies occupied Germany and then start to head home. And by the spring of 1919, we see the 10th Battalion returning to Calgary, and you might recognize some of the old buildings from downtown, but most of them are gone, unfortunately. And on the 23rd of April, they return home. Throughout the war, they suffered 1,405 killed and approximately 3 times that wounded. Of the 6 soldiers who we began to talk about, really only Brigadier Dan Ormand would survive. And he had fought from the very beginning, the first battle there at Kitchener's Wood, all the way to the end of the war, from the rank of captain to the rank of brigadier general, and had survived the war. So the war comes to an end, and now I want to talk for the next few minutes about remembrance and about how we commemorate those soldiers who went and fought and died during the war. So the Imperial War Graves Commission was founded in 1917, and their goal was to commemorate all of the casualties from the war, graves for those who were known where they're buried, and memorials for those who are missing. And we can see here from just after the war, 1919, this is actually David Mcandy's grave at a place called Beaufort British Cemetery. And it's a very temporary grave, but he'll be moved to another cemetery on the Somme where they consolidated some of them. And I'll show it, there'll be a picture in a little bit of graves of that type. The Canadians wanted to commemorate all of the Canadian battles, and there's Canadian organization founded to commemorate those important battles. So keeping in mind that Newfoundland was not part of Canada at the time, but I'll cover those off. So the Canadian ones were Vimy, so the great memorial you'll see on the right. The second one was St. Julian, which we talked about very beginning of the war. Hill 62, which is near Ypres. Courcelette, which was from the fighting on the Somme. Passchendale, there's a memorial, which we talked about near the fighting at Ypres. The Quesnel, Drury, and Bourlon Wood are really the push east near the end of the last 100 days. And then there's the Newfoundland Memorials, particularly the one at Beaumont-Hamel, which many will know are commemorated by a caribou. So these are established all across the battlefields and are opened through the 1920s and 1930s, with the Vimy Memorial opening in 1936. Back at home, the Canadian War Memorial in Ottawa is commissioned, and it is opened in 1939, which is remarkable, just before the start of the Second World War. And here we can see the Queen at the opening of the National War Memorial, and the veteran just to her right is actually, by this time, Major General Ormand, who had become a Major General after the war and then retired. I now want to talk about the 5 soldiers who didn't come home and how we remember them and have some local connections to those. So the first we'll talk about is Russell Boyle. If anyone's walked by City Hall, there's a plaque on the old City Hall, which you'll see on the left of the screen. And it's a memory of Colonel Boyle and the officers, NCOs, and men of the 10th Battalion who fell at that fighting in the Second Battle of Ypres, and particularly the counterattack at Kitchener's Wood. So if you're downtown, you might want to walk by and have a look at that. The plaque was added onto after the war. The 10th Battalion is perpetuated by the Calgary Highlanders and to remember the Calgary Highlanders from the Second World War. If you're ever at Central Memorial Park, there's a large statue in the center of a horseman, and it's believed, but not 100% confirmed, that this is, that Colonel Boyle was actually the posed for this statue because he had fought during the Boer War, and this statue is commemorative of the Boer War. And on the right, there's Colonel Boyle's grave from Popering in Belgium. And all the Canadians are buried in a similar grave markers if they're not on a memorial for the missing. Private Iwamato, he's buried, as I said, at Upton Wood Cemetery, in a similar grave to what you saw with Colonel Boyle, but he's also commemorated on the Japanese-Canadian Memorial at Stanley Park in Vancouver. And we should remember that during the war, or during the Second World War, many of these veterans, the ones who survived, the Japanese ones, were actually interned during the Second World War. And it was a huge, find the right word for it, but concern, because these men had fought and died and awarded gallantry medals fighting for Canada, and now they're being interned during the Second World War. And we should also keep in mind that they actually don't gain the right to vote until 1948, Japanese Canadians. This is a little bit more modern, but here is a plaque to Arthur Knight that was unveiled in 2015 at the town of Villers-le-Cagenicourt. And that's actually the grandnephew of Arthur Knight laying the wreath. And the Calgary Highlanders are still in touch with the whole Knight family who lived in Southeast England. David Mcgandy. So this is actually David's nephew, Mac Mcandy, and he did a pilgrimage and came to the military museums. He brought David's medals, and there's actually a piece of art hanging of David Mcandy at the military museums, which you can see on the left-hand side there. And finally, the one who had survived, Dan Ormand. These are General Ormand's medals on the left, and one of his relatives had visited the military museums, and a painting of him that's on display at the Calgary Highlanders Gallery of General Ormand. And that's his uniform, his hat, all of that's on display if you're so inclined to go and see it. And the last one I want to talk about is James Milne. So James Milne, as we mentioned, his body was not found after the battle, and he was commemorated on the Vimy Memorial. You can see here his name, J.A. Milne, and those names go across the bottom of the Vimy Memorial for all those who are missing. But an interesting twist to James Milne's story. In 2013, 2 sets of remains were found in France, almost 100 years after the war. And one of them was identified as James Milne. So I was involved in this project, and I find it incredible. So they were actually building a housing complex near the town of Arlo, and an archaeologist was working to clear the ground before the housing went in. And this is the place where James Milne's remains were found. His body was removed to the Commonwealth War Graves Mortuary in Beaurain, which is near Arras, and for identification. What was found with him were a number of artifacts, and you can see sort of on the left-hand side, I'm sure my pointer works, this is a 10th Battalion Cat Badge, the 10th Battalion collar badges. There was a number of items found with the body. And you can see these slightly cleaned up, the Cat Badge, a whistle, a penknife, and all of these items are now on display at the military museums of James Milne. His helmet, his boots, any of those sort of non-organic type things were found with him. And again, this helmet was brought back and is on display. And most importantly was the original identification disc, which obviously is very difficult to read, but when sent to some conservators, they were able to bring out enough that we could see his service number, and we could see he was the 10th Battalion, and you could see the end of the name Milne there, enough for us all to know for certain that this was James Milne's body that had been found.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And in the summer of 1917, 100 years to the year after his death, he was reburied at near Arlo at Orchard Dump Cemetery by soldiers of the Calgary Highlanders. And I'll just, it was probably one of the most moving events that I've ever been part of, but with full Highland honors, piper, bugler, his remains were laid to rest. Young soldiers who live in Calgary, who are now serving with that regiment, many of which have seen overseas service in Afghanistan and other places, did an outstanding job of interring him. And this is his now grave marker we have for James Alexander Milne, and he has his final resting place.
Wow, that's beautiful.
So that really brings to a close. I just wanted to tell those stories of those 6 Calgarians who went to the war, many of which did not come back. And if you have a moment to spare on the 11th of November, during whatever ceremony you're attending, I would encourage you to remember Russell Boyle, David Mcgandy, Private Iwamato, Sergeant Knight, Dan Ormand, and James Milne, who 5 of which who did not come home and lay buried in France and Belgium. And if you want to learn more about any of them, as well as Canada's military history, I encourage you to visit valourcanada.ca. As I mentioned, we're a not-for-profit organization, and we're always keen to engage with the community in any way to tell more about Canadian military history. And if you're interested in making a donation, you can do so at that site as well. So Colleen, that's my presentation, and I'm happy to sort of take any questions and answers that anyone might have. I don't know how many came in on the chat, but
well, we've got a couple coming in here, and you know, I just wanted to concur with you is that this just kind of, you know, solidifies the reason why we do what we do on Remembrance Day. And I think that what you're doing to educate the youth about the history, because I think it often gets lost, and they don't really have an understanding of what it is that Remembrance Day is and why we recognize these brave people. So I for sure will make sure that we have this information out at our presentation on Remembrance Day as well, and bring it to everyone's attention. And so I appreciate you sharing this with us. Got a few questions coming in, some through chat. Sharon, thank you for putting this presentation on. Informative, humbling, and yet proud to be a Canadian. And Sandra, thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation. Marilyn, will this presentation be available for others to view after today? I know my grandsons would be interested. Marilyn, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Whatever we can do to share. As I said, the video, we will have a video up on our Kirby Centre YouTube channel. But if Peter would like to share his presentation and the audio clip, then I can make sure that I send that out to anyone that's interested in that as well. And so everything that we can do to share this information with our younger generation, absolutely.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to share it. And I think maybe to add to my conclusion, I think we often go to Remembrance Day and we look at the cenotaph and we hear the big numbers, the 60,000 who were killed, and it's almost overwhelming. But when you can look, I hope as everyone is right now, at these faces and these eyes and realize that they're just local, regular people from our community who are ranchers, who were lawyers, who were farmers, and they went off and fought to preserve Canadian values, and we should remember them. Sorry.
And the sad thing, you know, for me is that they're Calgarians, but they're buried in Europe, or they're buried, you know, in the areas near where they fell. And you mentioned having relationship with one of the families. Are you still, or do they still have family here in Calgary, and do you stay in touch? Are you in touch with them at all?
So maybe I can talk to my relationship. The Boyle family is sort of scattered across the country. His grandson I'm in close contact with lives on Vancouver Island now. The Mcgandy family, Mac is in Scotland, and then the rest of his family actually are farm in Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, the Iwamato family, he was the only one who had come over from Japan, and we'd never really been able to connect with his ancestors in Japan. The Knight family, he had no children here, and his family, so it's again sort of like Mcandy, where it's a nephew, they all live near Dover in the southeast part of England. Mm-hmm. And the Ormand family, most of the family are out east, Ottawa and Montreal way. And unfortunately, the James Milne family, there's a few distant relatives we found in California. However, they didn't have a strong interest in his story, so we don't really have a link. So I guess in short, we've connections with 4 of the family, which is kind of remarkable 100 years after the fact.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, to find those artifacts, you know, fascinating, and to be able to follow the history of the conflicts. It must have been fascinating work for you. You're welcome to take your screen share off if you like, and then we can see your full screen. Sure. But it must have been fascinating to have done that research.
Yes. Sorry, just let me. Here we go. There we are. Perfect. Yes, particularly. So I've had connections, done research on all of them, but the Milne one was of particular interest because, well, obviously, ensuring that our Canadians are buried in France was just so interesting to making sure it was done properly and that we had all the information we could. So it was a humbling project to be part of. And I guess for those with concerns that those soldiers are buried so far away, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does incredible work to preserve those graves. You can show up there on almost any day of the middle of the winter, and the grass will be cut, the leaves will be raked, the flowers will be tended to, and the plants or flowers, depending on the time of year, they're just kept immaculately and really not forgotten. And any Canadian who goes there, I would encourage you, if you can, once COVID settles down, to think about it, because it's a great experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got a few more things coming in here. Excuse me. Colin, very interesting, and big thank you for putting this together. Love the Calgary content. And I think going back as well to your earlier portion of the presentation, making that connection with Signal Hill, Sarcee. So many of us have, you know, gone over to West Hills to shop and seen the rocks on the hill. And I think a lot of people sometimes have wondered why they're there. So it's great to be able to put that into context.
Yeah, so if you imagine you're standing on Signal Hill looking south, so you're now on the south side of Glenmore, pretty much where the new Sarcee Trail goes down, that was all a training camp that would go all the way east to the casino, but a huge training camp that was stood up in 1915 and was there till the end of the war. After the war, it was still used as a base. I think many of us will know Curry Barracks and Sarcee Camp, and was finally shut down not until the late 1990s.
Bill, thank you, Peter, and Marilyn, thank you for that possibility. Oh, the being able to share it. So yes, absolutely, Marilyn, we'll do whatever we can there. Valerie, I was born in Salisbury, near Stonehenge. And my father was a soldier who trained in Salisbury Plain. Valerie is one of our devoted guests attending many of our presentations. So thanks for sharing that, Val.
So if you know Amesbury, which is just east of Stonehenge, that's where the Canadians were stationed. And in fact, there's quite a few pictures of Canadians marching around those little towns, and even in and out of some of the pubs on their time off. So a great, it's a neat place. I've been out there before, so.
Yeah, she's just popped up. Yes, she does know Amesbury. And I bet you have some of your own stories that have trickled down from your family, Val. Let me see here. Marilyn, does anyone know if the Field of Crosses remains in place for any days after November 11th?
No, unfortunately, it doesn't. It will be open until then, and they do have some restrictions. Valor Canada partner with the Field of Crosses and does some educational programming around that. But unfortunately, you can visit it. They do have restrictions, particularly on the 11th, for how many people they can have there, just to ensure social distancing. But for the next 2 days, the sunrise and the sunset service occur. I was at the sunrise service on Saturday, so about 7:30, and forgive me, I'm not positive when the sunset service is, but you can attend those and you can visit the crosses. And then I think it will be in the afternoon after the 11 o'clock service that the crosses will be open. And then they shut them down and start to take them down after Remembrance Day.
And this must be a busy week for you.
Yes, it's a busy time for Valor Canada, which is great. It's what we do, and it's great to have all the interest.
Again, Val, thanks for the wonderful and moving presentation. Wendy, fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. I have the Passchendale SP, and we'll be, must be the movie she's referring to. And we'll be watching it before Remembrance Day. So
that movie, the character Paul Gross plays is actually in the 10th Battalion. So you'll see those collar dogs that I showed in that cat badge in that movie. I'm not sure how great a historical representation of the battle it was, but it's a great story nonetheless. Absolutely. It might be a good idea for all of us to kind of watch some of these, some of the movies that might be on TV here in the next few days. And if I can just add to that, Valor Canada has a YouTube channel. You can either access it from our website, but we have about, don't hold me to the exact number, about 40 short documentaries. So most of them are in the about 5-minute length, telling the stories actually of Russell Lambert Boyle, of a number of Calgarians, but also of General Currie. I won't list them all off, but there's short stories, or short documentaries about people who fought the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Afghanistan, and I encourage everybody around Remembrance Day that they might find some interest there. And they can find that in just the Valor Canada YouTube channel. Is that how they find those videos? Correct. Yeah, you can access it off of our main webpage if you go to documentaries from our main page, or just on the YouTube channel. Either way will get you to the same place. Okay, so we encourage everybody to visit your website then. Let me see. Mark, thank you, Peter and Kirby Center, for putting this on. Bill, please describe the relationship with the family by Kitchener's Wood. Sure, I'm not exactly sure what you mean there. So Kitchener's Wood is located northeast of Ypres, the town of Ypres in Belgium, just west of St. Julien, where the Canadian Memorial is. I know the family quite well, who actually owned the ground where the wood is, the Benteen family. And they have a memorial on their property to the 10th and the 16th. And in fact, so many people in the town of St. Julien don't forget what the Canadians did and fought there. I could list a number of people. Robert Messine is one of them, who have commemorations constantly. If you're a Canadian and you're going to visit the battlefields and you're not sure where to go, I can give you their email addresses and they will meet you and they will take you around and show you all the important places. But Kitchener's Wood is not exactly as you can imagine. It was, with all the artillery shells, there wasn't much of a wood left by the end of the war. There is a wood there now, which sort of takes a bit of a corner of the old wood. And the family, Benteens, again, welcome Canadians with open arms and remember with the memorials, and it's fantastic. On the 100th anniversary in 2015, we took a large group of Canadians there, and they actually they hosted a dinner in a large vehicle shed, I guess you'd say, for probably we're in the neighborhood of 300 Canadians. So we were on the battlefield 100 years to the minute after that attack. So Bill, I hope that answers your question. If you've got a follow on, I'd be happy to take it as well. Yeah, if there's anything else, I don't know, that's come to the end of the chats. If anybody else has anything else that they might like to ask or add,
I'll be happy to forward that on.